I'd been called many names: the daughter of a criminal, an unwanted child, a bastard. Later, the world remembered me differently, as a queen who ruled alone, without a husband, no support, no right to be wrong. My name is Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of a king, daughter of an executed queen, and the woman who should have outlived her own family. And this is my story. The story of a girl who should have broken, and yet became a queen before whom nations trembled. King Henry VIII had one dream: a son, an heir to bear his name and his wrath. And my mother, Anne Boleyn, a brilliant woman with a tongue sharper than a French dagger, promised him that. And then I was born, a girl. Some would say it was a disappointment, but I would add, not their last. My father didn't give up on me, not right away. He smiled, stroked my head, gave me clothes even his son couldn't reach. But I was born with one disadvantage. I wasn't a son. And the world around me reminded me of that before I could speak. The court whispered that I was not enough, that I was a mistake. Some said my mother would have to try harder. Like children are clothes you can change if they don't fit. My father carried me in his arms, but his eyes were always somewhere else. On the son he'd never seen, the one I was supposed to replace. My mother, she was beautiful, educated, dangerously smart. And that's a combination men either love or fear. The court loved her for the first year. The second year, less so. The third year, he was afraid. And me? I watched. A child who couldn't read yet, but could already see that the world of women was a bottle of poison that could tip over at any moment. And yet I was born a princess, the child of a king. But all princesses have one thing in common. Their value lasts only as long as their parents need them. And I was about to learn how quickly the love of a king can grow cold. When I was less than 3 years old, the world taught me my first lesson. The love of a king is as constant as the weather in London. My mother, Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom my father changed the faith and the face of England, was suddenly no longer needed. Not because of me, but because she gave the king only a daughter. And so he sought a solution. It started with a whisper, then an accusation, and finally a sentence that was too quick to be fair. Adultery? Treason? Incest? Yes, of course. Nothing saves a king's face like a well-chosen lie. She was executed on May the 19th, 1536, on Tower Green. Not with an axe. Her father was generous enough to have a French swordmaster brought in to make the execution quick and elegant. Of course, who wouldn't want an elegant execution? I was near the tower at the time. I don't remember her last words, or how the wind blew away the silence of the sword's impact. But I do remember that the door was shut in my face, and when they opened it again, I was no longer a princess. My father declared me illegitimate. The Queen's child became a nobody. All it took was one decision from the king, and the title disappeared as quickly as my mother's head. I was sent away from the court, to homes where I was to be seen as little as possible and heard even less. My cot, my governesses, my clothes, all gone. Which is fascinating when you consider that I haven't changed a bit. Just my value. I was a fast learner, not Latin or French, that came later, but to the most important thing, that a woman must be smart to survive a world that prefers blood on the sword to blood in the veins. My mother fell because she believed that the love of a king was enough. I have remembered that mistake all my life. After my mother's execution, I belonged nowhere. I wasn't a princess. I was not an heiress. I was just Elizabeth. And so they sent me away, under the supervision of teachers who were given a special task, to raise the daughter of a king who was not the daughter of a queen. I wasn't surrounded by gold. I had books, and those are far more dangerous. I learned Latin and Greek, French and Italian. I knew what logic was, what rhetoric was, and what a dangerous question asked in the wrong room was. I was a child, but I could read between the lines. How else do you survive when your family falls under swords instead of crowning kisses? My teachers were surprised. A girl my age wasn't supposed to talk about the philosophy of Aristotle or write letters in Latin in a style that wouldn't offend a university professor. But I knew that intelligence was the one possession that could not be confiscated by the king's signature. I had no toys. I had arguments. And that's when I learned another skill: silence. Everyone asks curiously. Few listen with the intention of helping. So I only answered when it was worthwhile. Some said I was too serious. Others said I was too smart. I only said what was necessary. And I watched a world that once tried to swallow me up, not to conform to it, but so that one day I would know how to control it without shouting and without a sword. A child can learn to play. I learned to play court politics. It wasn't a child's game, but I became the quietest and therefore most dangerous player in it. When I was 14, I wasn't a queen yet, just a teenage daughter of a king who had to learn to smile at the right people and keep quiet in front of the wrong ones. After my father died, his widow, Catherine Parr, took care of me. She was kind, educated, careful. And she had a husband, Thomas Seymour. If I had to sum up his character, I suppose I'd say too much ambition, too little sense. He was handsome, I'll give him that, and he was convinced he could have more than good looks. His attentions were not appropriate. It was dangerous. The touching of morning greetings, the unnecessary banter, the ambiguous questions, the unexpected entrances into my chambers. There was nothing romantic about it. It was a power play. And I was not a player, but a pawn he wanted to move. Catherine found out. Some might have expected an explosion of jealousy, but she understood that I wasn't the problem. The problem is a man trying to move a piece against her will. So she sent me away, not because she wanted to protect me by overprotecting me, but because a world full of whispers might one day say, I wanted to be moved. Thomas Seymour was later accused of treason, not because of me, but because he wanted to run the kingdom through the underage King Edward. Ambition without intelligence is always a short story. He was executed, and I was summoned for questioning. Again. Irony of fate, I was the daughter of an executed mother, and witness to an executed man I never wanted. I was interrogated harshly, precisely, without mercy. And I answered the way I learned as a child, not a word more than necessary. Eventually they let me go, and I remembered the one thing no woman who wants to survive in the palace can afford to forget. Saying no is not impolite. It's a defense of life. When my brother Edward died, England needed a king. Unfortunately, she got 2 wives. Mary Tudor, daughter of my father and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne as the rightful heir, and I became an overly popular relative. People love symbols, and the worst thing about symbols is that they never ask if you want them. Protestants wrote me letters calling me the Hope of England, while I sat in my house trying not to attract attention and praying that no one would think I was the hope of anything. Mary was not the tyrant history likes to paint her as. She was a wounded woman who saw in every Protestant an attack against her mother. Her faith was not politics, it was pain. And pain, when it rules, can be worse than a despot with a sword. And then came Wyatt's rebellion. A rebellion I didn't plan, didn't support, and which I learned about by hearsay, like all the scandals in my life. Yet thousands of people struggled with the fact that the only name they could whisper as a rescue was mine. And so I was arrested. Not because I was guilty, but because I was a symbol. They took me to the Tower, the same place where my mother died. I didn't cry, not because I was brave, but because I'd long ago learned that tears are a luxury of women who don't listen. I entered the Tower on March the 18th, 1554. The guards watched, some with pity, others with anticipation. And I ran my fingers over the stone wall and said to myself, they didn't come here to execute me. They brought me here to await the decision of others. And I can wait. I testified with respect. I answered accurately, never more than necessary, and never less than I could be accused of lying. Marie finally believed I wasn't part of the rebellion, or at least it suited her. Executing a popular nurse is not a good start to a reign. And so she didn't execute me. She put me under house arrest, where she could keep a better eye on me than in the fortress. I left the Tower alive, but not without a price. A drop of fear settled in me like moisture in stone, and from that day on, I knew that if I ever became queen, it wouldn't be through God, fate, or the law. It would be through intelligent survival. When Mary released me from the Tower, I didn't get my freedom. I got surveillance. House arrest is not a lockup. It's a cage made of guests who don't let you out of their sight, and servants who watch your every letter. I lived in the country, a beautiful place that had only one floor. I couldn't leave. I had books, but every piece of paper was dangerous. I had an education, but an educated woman was a potential threat. I had my own faith, but faith was judged in those days as much as crime. So I did what any reasonable person who doesn't want to end up on the border would do. I kept quiet. I prayed Catholic prayers, whatever I thought. I smiled, even though my teeth were clenched. And if someone asked me about politics, I answered in a way that made them think I was too stupid to be considered a threat. Being a woman often means this, surviving by being underestimated. My health was failing. Prisoners without bars are sick more often than those with them. But weakness is an invitation for others to attack. So I coughed into my pillow and got up the moment the footsteps sounded. Every morning I woke up thinking, if Mary dies, I die. If she survives too long, I will die too. The Queen married Philip II, King Philip of Spain. England was turning into a Catholic fortress, and the people were more afraid than when the sword stood over their heads. But I waited. Waiting is an art. And I became an artist. And then something happened that can't be planned or forced. Queen Mary fell ill, and the court began to whisper. Not about me this time, but about the future. And in those whispers, my name reappeared, not as a threat, but as a necessity. No joy came to me, just the knowledge that sometimes surviving means waiting until the enemy tires. Mary died on November the 17th, 1558, and I was brought to London, not with chains, not with a guard, but as heir to the throne, who became queen not by luck, but by never making the mistake the world expected of me. When I became queen, people expected two things: that I would rule and that I would marry as soon as possible. I'll do the first. I didn't. I accepted the crown on January the 15th, 1559, at Westminster Abbey, in a dress as golden as the sun, which seemed to convince everyone that England had finally found the light. The irony is that light tends to be scorching. The crowd cheered, the music played, the Latin words carried over everyone's heads, even those who didn't understand them. But I heard only one phrase whispered by politicians from both sides of the faith: "Whom will you marry?" England needed an ally, a man for legitimacy, a king who could lead an army. But I knew from childhood that a husband could be the beginning of the end for a woman. I saw my mother. I saw Catherine of Aragon. I saw Catherine Howard, another queen, executed. And I had the audacity to say to myself, I won't be next. When the council asked me about the groom, I smiled and said, I'm already engaged. To England. It was not a romantic statement. It was a legal defense mechanism. The queen married is weak. The queen unmarried is an unreadable risk. And illegibility is power. People used to say I was the Virgin Queen, as if my body was more important to England than my mind. They weren't wrong about that, but I planned to change that without anyone understanding exactly when the change happened. I was the first to restore the Protestant Church. I did it coldly, strategically. Act of supremacy. That's not a spiritual decision. It's a chess move. Then the act of uniformity, which forced England to unify worship, not because of faith, for the sake of order. Religion is useful when it serves the state. It's dangerous when it commands it. When I signed both bills, I knew I had just won the first game, without my husband, without a protector. Just by saying the word most women in my day weren't allowed to say. No. On the day I was crowned, the man who knew my silence better than anyone else stood in the audience. Robert Dudley. The son of a traitor whose father had been executed, a friend from my childhood, and a man the courtiers considered too close to the Queen. Coincidence? No, it's not. I made him my nearest and dearest, not because I was blinded by love, as the court later thought, but because I needed someone who knew me so well that he had no need to control me. Their fear was almost amusing. They whispered that I was getting married, that Dudley was going to be king. The courtiers acted as if my heart was a throne. But I intended to let the throne be the throne, and the heart be the heart, separately. And then his wife died, Amy Robsart, found at the foot of the staircase with a broken back. Few witnesses, few certainties, just questions. And the court looked at me as if my hands reached further than my power. No one ever proved that Robert had Amy killed. But politics only needs evidence when it's for protection. Suspicion is enough to accuse. If I married Robert, I'd be the Queen of suspicion, not the Queen of England. And so I left him by my side. It was enough for him. And I I had a man who was close enough to understand me, but never close enough to own me. People think love is about kisses and hugs. I think it's about guarding your own future without having it stolen in the name of happiness. Robert loved me, and I loved England. Not because I couldn't love a man, but because I was born in a country where romance gives a woman only two options: to become an ornament or a problem. I chose the third option: become a queen. The reign of a queen without a husband does not create a void. It creates hunger. The courtiers wanted to know who was whispering in my ear. Foreign envoys wanted to know whose kiss would convince me to ally with them. And the church wanted to know who I should fear. The answer was simple: no one. But to say no one, I needed a man who knew everything. Sir Francis Walsingham. Not a high nobleman, not a charming wolf like Dudley, but a silent spider who was willing to weave webs in the shadows. They called him my eye. I called him my certainty. It wasn't a romantic relationship. It was a relationship that held England together. Under his leadership, a network of spies was created to protect not my honor, but my crown. They withheld letters. They decoded the plot. They intercepted the plans of foreign kings and domestic fanatics. They knew about the conspirators before the conspirators knew themselves. And me? I smiled for the audience and signed execution orders when there was no doubt. Not that I was cruel. A queen who rules without a husband must have other ways of maintaining respect. I didn't use the execution as a means of anger, but I have shown that my goodwill is no reason to attack. Espionage isn't about information. It's about believing you have it. And so I became the most invisible ruler in Europe, without a king, without an army led by my own hand, without a weapon. I ruled with a smile, a strict law, and a truth that I made deadly by keeping silent. The court thought I was held by their flattery. Europe thought I was held by their threats. In reality, only one thing held me: information. And a queen who knows more than her enemies doesn't need a king. She was beautiful. She was Catholic. And she was a queen. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. The courtiers tended to describe her as if she were out of a novel. Tragic, misunderstood, noble. I saw something else. I saw a woman who was loved because she wanted to be loved, not because she could rule. Were we rivals? No, we weren't. It was politics, not the personal drama of two women. Mary was a threat because she was the Catholic heiress to the English throne, and Europe, led by King Philip II of Spain, looked upon her as a better investment than me. When Mary married into Scotland, I wished her no harm. But she chose a man who was stupid, ambitious, and cruel. And then another who was perhaps even worse. And so her royal life became a chain of scandal, murder, and rebellion. Eventually, she was forced to flee. To where? England. To me. She came not as a queen, but as a problem everyone expected me to solve. I kept her in safe comfort, a guest, not a prisoner. That's important to understand. She was not locked in a cell, but in a cage of rank. And at the same time, Spain was watching my every move. Philip II considered a Catholic on the English throne an investment called Mary Stuart. And the Catholics in my country began to write whisper, plotting, not against the church, against me. The spy network has uncovered the plots, one by one. Letters cover passwords, secret messages, and Mary's name as the signature of destiny. She wasn't arrested for her faith, but for her part in planning my murder. It's not an exaggeration to say I hesitated. She wasn't just a woman. She wasn't just a queen. She was a precedent. The court condemned her. I signed the sentence, even though I knew I was giving Europe a reason for war. She was executed on February 8th, 1587, in the scarlet robe of a martyr. And I said to myself, noblemen are interested in sympathy. The Queen is interested in England. Philip II was given a reason, an army approaching with 130 ships and prayers. The Spanish army. England was in for a storm. Spain voted for war from the moment I signed Mary Stuart's sentence. But in fact the war began much earlier, when I said no to royal marriage. Philip II was convinced that a woman on the throne was a temporary mistake that could be corrected with ships. So he sent his faith, his troops, and 130 ships of the Spanish Armada. He wanted to remove me and put a Catholic successor on the throne. Not with an arrow, not by murder in the night, but by invasion. England didn't have the best ships. She didn't have the biggest army. But it had time, which I bought by not entering into any hasty alliances. And it had men who knew that to die for England was not fanaticism, that honour. I did not lead them into battle. A queen on horseback cannot fight ships in the Channel. But I stood before them in Tilbury, in armour that was not practical but expedient. And I said words that remind me to this day that sometimes only the voice wins. I know I have the body of a weak woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and an English king at that. It wasn't a line about courage. It was a sentence of confidence. The fleet led by Francis Drake and Lord Howard did not get my hand, but it had my authority. And when we fought the Spanish, we found two things. Their ships were bigger, but ours were faster. And then came a force that never asked my permission. The storm. Wind and water finished the job our guns had begun. The Spanish army was crushed more by the ocean than by us. And yet people believed I was the one who defeated the empire. I didn't fix them, not because I take credit, but because the nation needs a face at the helm, a winning face. The Queen who never fell, even when the war was won by wind and sea, is still a victor. And so they called me Gloriana, a name that is never repaired or hung on a wall. Victory was proof that England had no king, and that it wasn't a problem. It's a strength. Victory over the army was the beginning, not the end. The courtiers wanted celebrations, the poets wanted similes, and the common people wanted to drink. I wanted silence, to hear what Europe would do next. And Europe was silent. We had a moment when no one pressed us, and I took advantage of it. Not with blood, not with war, but by investment. I supported the sailors Martin Frobisher, John Hawkins, Francis Drake, and later Walter Raleigh. Not because they were heroes, but because they could find their way where others couldn't reach with a map. The colonies are not a romance. They're markets. Trade is gold. Gold means armies. An army means peace. So I began to build an England that could survive without the Spanish hand over its head. And while men conquered the oceans, others conquered the stage. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and a whole generation of playwrights who gave England not just entertainment, but identity. Dramas are not just stories. They are lessons for the nation. And I've allowed those lessons to be performed in front of people from all walks of life. Not because I love art, but because I loved England. A nation that can recognize itself in a story will not be easily swayed by a stranger. And so my reign became a golden age, not because it was rich in celebration, but because it was rich in speech. Soldiers protect the border. Words protect nations. And I knew that when the English people started telling stories about themselves, they would become someone who would never be rewritten. I didn't want to be the mother of a nation, but I became its voice. And the voice survives longer than the crown. No one expects a queen to grow old. The courtiers see only the dress, the crown, the ceremonies, the portraits, the cheers. But it all has one weakness: time. I was entering my 50s with no husband, no children, no heir, and no regrets. Politicians feared the future. I didn't. The future is the problem of the living. People said I was getting old, like it was news. I knew it long before they did. My hair was turning grey. I started hiding it with wigs, not because of vanity, but because the Queen mustn't tell time. My teeth were weakening. I used my smile less. My body ached. Pain is not a problem. Pain is just a reminder that you still rule. People have asked if I regret not having children. They didn't ask the right question. The right question is, how many children does the Queen who rules the nation have? England was my duty. Duties are not bequeathed to children. They are bequeathed to historians. I have earned admiration, fear, loyalty, and sometimes hatred. People died around me. Young friends grew old. Robert Dudley died in September 1588. A few days later, I received his letters, which I kept until I died. Not because I was broken, but because memories are safer than love. And while my court dealt with fashion, religion, intrigue, I dealt with a future I would no longer control. To rule is to decide. To grow old is to watch the world speed by without you. But I didn't back down, not even in pain, not in fatigue, nor in time. Because the throne is not a place where you can afford to be weak. And I knew one thing that many kings won't admit. You're not supposed to rule less before the end. You're supposed to rule harder. I never wanted to lie down. A lying person is a patient. When the end came, he didn't come as the hero of a tragedy. It came as fatigue, a cold that couldn't be warmed, a silence that wasn't still, eyes that no longer wanted to watch the world. The servants offered me a bed. They offered pillows, warmth, comfort. But I was sitting on the floor, in silence, in clothes that were too heavy for a body that no longer had the strength. "Your Majesty, you must lie down." But I heard something else. Surrender. And I didn't give up for 44 years. Why now? Sir Robert Cecil, loyal to the end, waited for me to speak. They wanted to know who I would appoint as successor. James I, son of Mary Stuart. An irony some would consider poetic, But I've never had a weakness for poetry. I let England unite in peace, not for the sake of the succession, for stability. I let the son of the woman I had executed rule my country, because England needed a king. Not an apology. When I finally closed my eyes, I still wasn't sitting like a normal woman. That's not romanticizing. It's a fact. The Queen doesn't have the last bed. She has the last decision. And that's what I made before I left. The other queens were wives, mothers, daughters who were born to arranged unions. I was the decision, not love, a choice. Not a crown on her head, but a crown she never let out of her hand. To rule without a husband is not a triumph. It's loneliness that can be louder than applause. It is power that has sharp edges, and loyalty that never hugs. And yet, I carried it, without a king, without an heir of my blood, without anyone to determine what I should be. They called me the Virgin Queen, as if purity were my gift. They didn't understand that my purity wasn't about my body. It was about the power I never gave up. I didn't stay untouched for God or for virtue. I remained intact because I refused to let anyone else rule with me. Government is a union, and I chose a single partner, England. I didn't want the world to remember me as a woman who had a man. I wanted the world to remember me as a woman who had a nation. And so I ruled, firmly, patiently, without fear of noise or silence, because the throne is not a place where you can afford a heart. The throne is a place where you can only afford power. And I was the strength that never gave up, a power that did not procreate, a power that fought back both silently and loudly. And if I've ever been lonely, it's only because power never has the accompaniment one desires. But it's worth the price, and I paid it. No discount. If you want to hear more voices, stories, decisions, and power that has survived the century, join in. Subscription is not a request. It's permission to stand by the throne of the past. The past whispers. The future listens.